Holloway slammed his fist on the table and shouted at the entire room, "I don't care what squadron it comes from. Any jet will do, just not that one." He had just dismissed the only pilot already airborne, the only aircraft already moving toward the smoke. 12 people were dying in that canyon. Every advanced fighter was grounded. Every screen in his command center was lying to him, and the woman he had just called a museum piece had already changed course without waiting for his permission. 30 seconds later, the windows shook. That unmistakable engine sound rolled across the base, low, heavy, and absolutely certain. Holloway froze. She was already there. If this kind of story moves you, real courage, real stakes, real people, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Nevada desert in late August doesn't forgive anything. It doesn't forgive bad decisions. It doesn't forgive slow thinking. And it absolutely does not forgive the kind of pride that mistakes confidence for competence. Colonel Grant Holloway had built his entire career on the belief that newer was better, faster was smarter, and the future belonged to the man who embraced it first. Standing inside the gleaming command center at Nellis Air Force Base, surrounded by screens that could track every aircraft within 200 miles, he felt like proof of that belief. He felt like the future standing right here in real time. I was about to learn that the future doesn't always arrive when you call for it. The joint readiness exercise had been months in the planning. It was the kind of operation that senior officers dream about, a massive multi-unit, multi-platform coordination event designed to stress test a brand new digital command network. The idea was simple in concept and brutally complex in execution. Every aircraft, every vehicle, every ground team would be connected through a single integrated system. Commanders would see everything. Every pilot would share data with every other pilot. Decisions would be made faster because information would move faster. The future of American air power, the briefers had said, was not about brute strength, it was about perfect awareness. Holloway believed that with everything he had. The exercise began at dawn. F-35s swept across the northern range in tight formation, their sensor packages uploading targeting data in real time. Electronic warfare aircraft flew racetrack patterns that sent deliberate interference across practice frequencies, testing the network's resilience. Helicopters coordinated with simulated ground forces. 12-person joint tactical recovery teams, the men and women who would extract downed pilots in isolated units in a real conflict, practiced their recovery procedures with a level of digital support that would have seemed science fiction 20 years ago. One of those teams was Guardian 6. Call sign Guardian 6 was a mixed-unit tactical recovery element led by Captain Noah Mercer, a compact, serious officer from Alabama, who had been doing this kind of work for 9 years. His team included vehicle crews, medics, 2 communications specialists, and Technical Sergeant Maya Torres, his ground-to-air coordinator. Maya was the team's link to the sky. When an aircraft was overhead, she talked to it. She understood pilots the way most people understand their oldest friends, by instinct, by the silences between words, by what they didn't say. Guardian 6's mission that day was straightforward: to reach a simulated crash site in a remote canyon on the northern edge of the training range, confirm the recovery of 2 simulated downed pilots, and extract the team to a designated safe point. Simple, rehearsed, clean. Then the storm came. It didn't appear on any of the morning forecasts, not on the base meteorology system, not on the satellite feeds, not on the advanced weather integration module that was part of the new digital network and that Holloway had praised to visiting observers just 3 hours earlier. It formed fast and hard over the northern range, a tight electrical storm that moved with the kind of deliberate speed that the desert occasionally produces to remind human beings of their place in things. Lightning hit a communications relay station at 11:47. The relay handled data routing for roughly 40% of the network's northern sector, and when it went down, the system didn't crash cleanly. It did something worse. It kept running. It kept displaying information. It kept feeding data to every screen in the command center and every cockpit in the exercise. But the information it was displaying was old. It was frozen. It was showing commanders a picture of the world that had stopped updating more than 4 minutes earlier. Nobody knew that yet. What they knew was that the exercise had suddenly gotten complicated. A wildfire ignited near the canyon where Guardian 6 was working, started by a lightning strike on a stand of dead brush that had been baking in August heat for 6 weeks. Wind carried the fire east, then shifted it north, then pushed it back and sent it climbing the canyon walls in ways that no predictive model had anticipated. And somewhere inside the growing smoke, Guardian 6 was still moving. Captain Mercer's voice came through the radio with the flat, controlled urgency of a man who had learned not to panic because panicking cost time he never had. Nellis Command, this is Guardian 6. We have a situation. Vehicle 3 has overturned on the south approach. I have 2 personnel down, 1 serious leg injury, 1 smoke inhalation. Fire is moving toward our position from the southwest. Request immediate guidance on alternate extraction route. Over. Holloway leaned toward the primary display. The screen showed Guardian 6 stationary on a road that, according to the map, was clear. The screen showed no fire threat within 2 miles of their position. The screen showed a straightforward extraction corridor heading north. Tell Mercer the northern road is clear, Holloway said. He needs to get moving. His senior operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Cole, hesitated. Sir, we're getting fragmentary radio reports from the range safety team that there may be fire across the northern corridor. The satellites are obscured and we can't visually confirm. The network shows it clear. The network may be running on delayed data, the relay strike. If the network had a problem, it would flag the problem. That's what it's designed to do. Holloway turned back to the screen. Tell Guardian 6 to move north. Cole looked at the screen. He looked at Holloway. He made the call that would haunt him for a long time afterward. Guardian 6 Nellis Command, northern corridor appears clear. Recommend immediate movement to extraction point Alpha. Over. Mercer's voice came back 9 seconds later. Negative on northern corridor. We have visual on fire across that route. Repeat fire is blocking the northern road. The road is gone. We cannot move north. Over. The room went quiet. Holloway stared at the screen, which still showed the northern corridor as open and clear, because the system was displaying a world that no longer existed. What's our aerial support status, he said. His operations staff began moving. Within 90 seconds, they had assembled the picture, and the picture was not good. The 2 F-35s assigned to the northern sector were returning. Fuel state critical after extended sensor runs. Divert to base. Unavailable. The F-16 is on standby alert had been pulled from ready status for lightning safety inspections after the storm crossed the field. Air Force protocol, unavailable for at least 30 minutes. The primary rescue helicopter, a Pavehawk, that could have been over Guardian 6 in 15 minutes had reported 0 visibility conditions at the canyon entrance. The smoke was too thick, the turbulence too severe. The crew commander refused to enter without accurate ground-level information about visibility and safe approach corridors. That was not cowardice. That was professionalism. But it still meant the helicopter was holding. Our reconnaissance aircraft was available at Creech. Transit time to the canyon, 38 minutes. Satellite imagery over the area obscured by smoke and cloud cover. No update expected for at least 20 minutes. Holloway stood in the center of a room full of the most sophisticated military technology in the world, and every single piece of it was telling him it couldn't help him right now. There has to be something, he said. I didn't say it to anyone in particular. He said it the way a man says something when he's arguing with a situation instead of solving it. Second Lieutenant Owen Price was 26 years old and had been in the Air Force for 3 years. He was assigned to the exercise as an auxiliary staff observer, which was a polite way of saying he was there to learn and mostly to stay out of the way. He was standing at the far edge of the room near an auxiliary readiness terminal, a secondary system that tracked aircraft not formally assigned to the exercise but airborne in the general area. He had been watching the board for the last 4 minutes. He cleared his throat. Nobody heard him. He took 1 step forward. Sir, Holloway didn't look up. Price raised his voice just enough. Colonel Holloway, sir, there's an A-10C on the auxiliary board. Airborne right now. Maintenance verification flight northwestern range. She's less than 70 miles out. The room didn't exactly go quiet because it was already quiet, but something shifted. A few people looked at Price. A few more looked at Holloway. Cole looked at the terminal over Price's shoulder and confirmed it. He's right, Cole said carefully. Major Rachel Bennett, A-10C tail, number 706. Airborne since 0945. She's in the verification circuit, but she's already up. Holloway looked at the board. Then he dismissed it. He dismissed it the way you dismiss something that doesn't fit the picture you've already decided on, the picture that tells you what the world should look like. An A-10, he said, not a question, not an acknowledgement, a verdict. That aircraft doesn't have the sensor package to support a complex extraction, he continued. It can't share data with the network. It's not equipped for the coordination this situation requires. I asked for a jet capable of solving the problem, not a museum piece. Price felt his heart drop somewhere near the floor. He opened his mouth. Sir, it is a jet. It's armed, it's airborne, and it can be over that canyon in under 8 minutes. Thank you, Lieutenant. Holloway's tone was the specific kind of polite that means stop talking. When I want the auxiliary board's recommendation, I'll ask for it. Price took a step back. He didn't retreat entirely. He kept his eyes on the screen. Cole pulled up Rachel Bennett's service record. He scanned it quickly. His expression shifted in a way that Holloway didn't notice, because Holloway was looking at a map. Cole noticed the assignment history, the transfer to evaluation duty, the stalled promotion, the disciplinary flag, and recognized the name. He would explain that to Holloway soon, but not yet. At the radar station, a young operator named Specialist Donnelly was watching a blip on his secondary screen. The blip was not on a course he expected. It was moving northeast. It was accelerating, and it was heading directly toward the canyon. Sir, Donnelly said, tail 706 is she's changed course. Holloway looked up. Before anyone could say anything else, they heard it. It came through the walls before it came through the windows. A deep, unmistakable, low-frequency roar, not the sharp crack of a supersonic fighter, not the turbine whine of a modern strike aircraft. This was something older and heavier and more deliberate. The engines of a Fairchild Republic A-10C Thunderbolt II. Two high-bypass turbofans producing a sound that pilots who've worked close air support for 20 years describe the same way every single time, like something that means it. Every person in the command center turned toward the windows. The aircraft was already past them, gray against gray, storm clouds wings level for exactly 1 second, then banking hard toward the north, toward the canyon, toward the smoke, toward 12 people who were running out of time and rodent choices. It moved with a decisiveness that the room felt before anyone processed it intellectually. Then the radio opened. The voice was even measured, carrying the particular quality that experienced pilots develop not from training, but from doing things that don't go right and figuring out how to bring everyone home anyway. Guardian 6, this is Rook 1. I heard your call. Give me your condition and your remaining time. 3 things happened simultaneously in the command center. Holloway recognized that the pilot he had dismissed as a museum piece was already airborne and already over to the problem, already talking to the team he hadn't been able to reach. Cole found the line in Rachel Bennett's record that made the name click. He remembered where he'd heard it before, and Owen Price, standing at the auxiliary terminal with his hands clasped behind his back, allowed himself exactly one quiet exhale. Down in the canyon, Maya Torres was gripping a radio handset so hard her knuckles had gone pale. The smoke was thickening above them. She could hear fire in the canyon walls, not dramatically, not the way movies present it, but as a low, persistent crackling, like the desert itself was being consumed from the inside. 2 of her teammates were down. Mercer was working the situation with everything he had, but she could see in his jaw that he was running calculations that weren't coming out right. She keyed the radio. Rook 1, Guardian 6. We have 12 personnel, 4 vehicles. 3 operational, 1 overturned, unable to move. 1 team member non-ambulatory, serious leg trauma. 1 member experiencing respiratory distress. Northern is fire blocked. We are approximately 22 minutes from critical fire encroachment. Over. A brief pause, not a long one, just long enough for Rachel to take in what she'd been told and begin organizing what she was going to do about it. Copy all, Guardian 6. I'm coming to you. Mark your position with smoke, if you have it. I'll be overhead in 4 minutes. Back in the command center, Holloway hadn't moved. He was still looking at the window at the space where the A-10 had been visible for less than 5 seconds before disappearing into the storm. Get her on the command channel, he said. Cole made the call. Rachel's voice entered the room. Nellis Command Rook 1, I'm 30 miles out descending toward the canyon entrance. Request you have Guardian 6 mark position. I'll coordinate extraction from overhead. Over. Rook 1, this is Colonel Holloway. He kept his voice level, professional. Whatever he was feeling, he wasn't going to broadcast it. You are not assigned to this exercise. You deviated from your verification flight profile. Explain your actions. A beat. Sir, I was on guard frequency. I heard Guardian 6's emergency call. I had fuel in position. I am the closest airborne asset to their location. I redirected. Over. You redirected without authorization. Yes, sir, I made a judgment call. If that requires a debrief when this is over, I'll accept that. But right now, I need you to let me work the problem. Over. There was something in the way she said it, not defiant, not aggressive, not the way someone talks when they're trying to win an argument. She said it the way a doctor says we need to deal with this right now. Like the argument was a luxury she'd happily pay for later, but couldn't afford this minute. Holloway looked at Cole. Cole said nothing, but his expression said, let her work. Holloway pressed the transmit button. Rook 1, you are not not authorized for unsupported entry into that canyon. Hold at altitude until we can establish proper coordination. Over. A pause slightly longer than the last one. Copy that, Nellis, holding at altitude. But Colonel, my 8 minutes is your 12 people. Over. She said it without sharpness, without theater. The way you state a fact when you're hoping the person on the other end is paying attention. In the canyon, Maya Torres heard both sides of that exchange. She had her radio tuned to the command frequency out of habit. She'd spent enough years as a ground coordinator to know exactly what she was listening to. A pilot who could see the problem, a colonel who couldn't see past the protocol, and 12 people, including her, standing in the middle. Mercer appeared at her shoulder. His face was damp with sweat and ash. He looked at her radio. Who is Rook 1? He asked. Maya didn't answer immediately. She was listening. She was making calculations of her own. Someone who knows what she's doing, she finally said, whether they let her or not. Mercer looked up at the sound of engines somewhere above the smoke. He couldn't see the aircraft, but he could hear it. He'd worked with enough close air support in his career to recognize the difference between a jet that was up there doing a job and a jet that was up there waiting for permission. This one was doing a job. Get her on your radio, he said to Maya. Maya was already pressing the button. At altitude above the smoke, Rachel Bennett held her A-10 in a steady orbit, climbing just high enough to see the thermal columns rising from the canyon floor, reading them the way you read a book you have read before. She knew this terrain, not specifically this canyon, but this kind of terrain. The desert didn't change the fundamentals. Fire moved uphill, wind followed the canyon walls, smoke packed densest in the lowest points. She'd grown up in Eastern California, 20 miles from this Mojave, and she'd watched wildfires from the time she was 7 years old. Her uncle had been a smoke jumper. He taught her to read fire the way other men teach their children to read weather. Her navigation display was giving her half-truths. The storm had hit local transmitters in ways that the digital system hadn't fully acknowledged, which meant the moving map on her primary screen was showing her a landscape that was slightly critically wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong enough to get someone killed if they trusted it completely. She switched to visual navigation. She had paper charts stored in a zippered pocket beside her right knee. She pulled out the relevant section, the Northern Range map, and propped it against her kneeboard. She'd carried paper charts on every flight for 15 years, even when colleagues laughed at her for it. She carried them because she'd seen networks fail and GPS spoof and software crash. She carried them because if 12 lives were ever going to depend on what was in her cockpit, she wanted something that didn't need a relay station to function. She worked the map against the terrain visible through her canopy, identifying ridgelines, road cuts, a dry wash that appeared in the paper chart as a dotted maintenance track. Then she heard Maya Torres on the radio, and the calm in Maya's voice told Rachel something that no instrument could measure, that the team was still coherent, still working together, still fighting. That mattered more than any of the specific details. It told her the situation was serious, but not yet collapsed. Guardian 6, Rook 1, I have your general position. I cannot come below the smoke yet. I need you to describe what you can see to your northwest 30 meters off the road in the last light. Look for a line of brush that runs roughly parallel to your direction of travel. Tell me if you see it. Over. Mercer was the one who looked. He moved to the edge of the overturned vehicle and stared into the haze. Northwest. I see, yes. There's a line. Low brush, maybe a foot tall, running along a depression. That's a service road, Rachel said. It's not on your digital map because it's old, but I see it from up here. It runs 600 meters before it hits a junction. I need to know if your operational vehicles can handle a 15-degree slope. Over. Mercer looked at his lead vehicle driver, a specialist named Gutierrez, who'd been driving in difficult terrain for 6 years. Gutierrez gave him a single nod. Affirmative, Rook 1. We can handle the grade. Over. Then we have a route, Rachel said. But I need command to authorize a descent so I can visually mark the entrance. Over. Nellis Holloway was watching the screen that still showed the northern quarter as clear and the fire as a distant threat. He was starting to understand slowly, painfully, the way pride prevents fast understanding that the screen might be lying to him. Cole appeared at his side. He spoke quietly because what he was about to say wasn't something he wanted the visiting observers to hear. Colonel, I know who Bennett is, not from her record. I was on the review panel for the Arizona incident 6 years ago. Holloway looked at him. She saved a ground team that command had written off, Cole continued. She did it by staying on station past the official withdrawal, and then she submitted cockpit recordings that showed senior officers had approved the original route that put the team in danger. Holloway's jaw tightened. That's the incident that flagged her record. It is. She challenged the investigation. She corrected it. Cole kept his voice even. There's a difference. At the far side of the room, a young radar operator said very quietly, Sir, she's still at altitude. Holloway knew what that meant. She was waiting for him. She was obeying his order. She was holding a position that was costing her time and costing the team below her options. And she was doing it because, whatever anyone thought of her, she understood command authority, and she wasn't the kind of person who would defy it just because she was right. That perhaps more than anything cracked something open in Holloway's thinking. He could not have explained it in the moment. Only later in the debrief, in the long and honest conversation he would have with Cole, over coffee in a room with no observers, would he find the words. What he'd seen in the last few minutes was not insubordination dressed up as heroism. What he'd seen was a pilot with better situational awareness than anyone else in this crisis who was still working within the structure of his authority, still asking permission, still respecting the chain of command even when it cost her. The people who were reckless, he realized, didn't ask permission. They didn't explain themselves. They didn't say, I'll take the debrief later. They just acted and left others to clean up the wreckage. Rachel Bennett had done the opposite of that at every step. He pressed the transmit button. Rook 1 Nellis command. You are authorized to descend below the smoke layer for visual marking of the service route. Do not enter below minimum safe altitude without reporting. Over. Maya Torres heard those words from inside the canyon, and she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she heard the engines change pitch, dropping in altitude, the sound deepening as the A-10 descended through the smoke, and she opened her eyes and went to work. Inside the cockpit, Rachel pushed the nose down with the measured precision of someone who had done this specific maneuver in training so many times that her hands knew it before her brain finished issuing the instruction. She entered the smoke. The world outside her canopy went gray and brown and orange at the edges. Heat turbulence grabbed the aircraft and shook it hard, a rolling rhythmic violence that anyone who hasn't felt it thinks they understand but doesn't. She kept the wings level. She kept her eyes moving. She cross-referenced the paper chart against the terrain, visible through the turbulence matching ridge shapes to printed contours. She was flying an aircraft that every modern planner said was outdated with navigation tools, that her colleagues called obsolete through conditions that no automated system was going to solve toward 12 people who had run out of everything except time, and even that was nearly gone. She found the entrance to the service road. She reached for the flare system. Not as weapons, as lights, as markers that would cut through smoke and give Maya Torres and Noah Mercer something visible to follow, something that said, here, this direction, this is the way. She deployed 2 flares on a downward angle, placing them at the entrance of the service road like lanterns hung on either side of a door. In the canyon, Maya saw them. She grabbed Mercer's arm. She pointed. There, that's our route. Mercer looked at the flares burning through the smoke. He looked at his team. He looked at the injured personnel, the overturned vehicle, the fire moving closer with its persistent, terrible patience. He made the call. Guardian 6, mount up. We're moving. Follow the lights. The convoy began to roll. Inside the command center at Nellis Air Force Base, Colonel Grant Holloway watched a secondary camera feed from a range safety drone that had partially cleared the smoke layer. Grainy, unstable footage, barely usable, and saw two bright points of orange light inside the canyon. He saw a gray aircraft banking around them. He saw vehicles moving. He pressed his hands flat on the operations table and stared at the screen. Owen Price was standing 3 feet to his left. The young lieutenant said nothing. He just watched, because there was nothing to say. The aircraft nobody wanted had arrived first. The pilot nobody believed in was already solving the problem. And the colonel who had dismissed them both was beginning to understand in the way that honest men eventually do that he had been wrong, not about procedure, not about protocol, not about the chain of command. He had been wrong about something more fundamental. He had looked at a weathered aircraft in an inconvenient record and decided he knew what they were worth. He had not considered even for a moment that the woman inside that cockpit might know something about saving 12 people that no screen in his command center could teach him. The convoy was moving, the flares were burning, and Rook 1 was in the smoke. The convoy was moving, but moving wasn't the same as safe. Maya Torres understood that better than anyone on the ground. She'd spent 9 years as a ground-to-air coordinator, which meant she'd spent 9 years in the space between what pilots could see and what ground teams could survive, translating one reality into the other as fast as language allowed. She knew that the 2 flares Rachel had dropped were burning, that the vehicles were following them, and that the service road beneath their wheels was real. But she also knew that 22 minutes had been their estimate 6 minutes ago, which meant they now had 16, maybe less, depending on wind, before the fire reached a point where no road and no aircraft and no amount of courage was going to be enough. She kept that calculation to herself. Mercer was already working at full capacity. The last thing he needed was his coordinator narrating the clock. Rook 1 Guardian 6, she said into the radio, keeping her voice flat and professional. Convoy is mobile. 3 vehicles in sequence. Lead vehicle is 60 meters past the flare markers. We have the route. What's ahead of us? Over. Rachel's voice came back inside 4 seconds, and the steadiness of it was the kind of thing you only achieve by deciding somewhere deep and private that panic is a choice you refuse to make. Guardian 6, the service road runs clean for approximately 400 meters. There is a junction at the end. You want the left fork. The right fork dead ends at a drainage berm. I'll mark the junction when you get there. Over. Copy Rook 1. Left fork at the junction. Confirm 400 meters. Over. Confirmed. How's your injured personnel? Over. Mercer had heard that last exchange from the second vehicle. He keyed his own handset. Rook 1, this is Mercer. Sergeant Cole has fracture of the left femur, no arterial bleed. He's stable, but he cannot be moved without the vehicle. Corporal Rains is ambulatory, but compromised. We need the vehicle, and we need the route to hold. Over. A beat, just long enough for Rachel to take in what that meant, that this was not a scenario where they could abandon the slow vehicle and move the personnel on foot. That every choice from this point forward had to account for a man who couldn't walk. Understood, Captain. Keep moving. I'm with you. Over. Back at Nellis, Holloway was watching the drone feed with the specific kind of focus that comes when a man realizes he's watching something he cannot control and must find a way to be useful anyway. The feed was bad, grainy, intermittent dropping frames, but it was the only visual confirmation they had that the convoy was moving. Cole appeared beside him with a printout. Range safety says that service road wasn't on the primary exercise map because it was classified as low-maintenance access only, no regular traffic. But it was surveyed and cleared years ago. How far does it go? That's what we don't know. The digital database doesn't have the full corridor data. The records that exist are in the archive paper logs. Cole paused. Lieutenant Price found a reference to a maintenance report. He's looking for the original document now. Holloway turned and looked at Price, who was at a secondary terminal, moving through scan file indexes with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that the difference between finding something and not finding it might be measured in human lives. The young lieutenant wasn't waiting for permission. He wasn't asking whether this was his job. He was doing it because it needed to be done. Holloway looked at him for a moment longer than he intended to. Then he turned back to the screen. Tell Price to keep going, he said. In the canyon, the convoy reached the 400-meter mark. Maya saw the junction exactly where Rachel had said it would be. She also saw something else, a column of black smoke rising directly ahead of the right fork, thick and vertical, the kind that comes from something burning hot and close. Rook 1, we're at the junction. Visual confirmation on your right fork warning. There is active fire on that route. Left fork is clear. Turning left. Over. Good eyes, Guardian 6. You're going to see the terrain open up about 200 meters after the turn. There's a flat area, looks like it was used for equipment staging at some point. Get your vehicles into that space and consolidate. I need to check something. Over. Mercer heard that and he didn't like it. He pressed the transmit button immediately. Rook 1, what are you checking over? A pause. There's a secondary road on the north side of the staging area. I can see it from altitude, but I can't confirm the surface condition without a visual pass. I'm going to drop below the smoke for 30 seconds. Nellis command is aware. Over. Holloway, listening on the same frequency, pressed his own transmit button. Rook 1, Nellis command. You are approaching minimum safe altitude. Do not go below 800 feet. Over. Another pause. This one was slightly different from the others. Not defiant, but weighted. Colonel, 800 feet puts me above the smoke. I cannot assess the road surface from above the smoke. I need one pass at 400 feet. 30 seconds. In and out. Over. Rook 1, the risk to your aircraft is mine, sir. Every decision I make up here, I own. I'm not asking you to accept the risk. I'm asking you to let me take it. Over. The room at Nellis went quiet enough that Holloway could hear the ventilation system. He was aware of eyes on him. Cole, Price, the visiting observers, Brigadier General Evelyn Shaw, who had arrived at the command center 17 minutes ago and had been standing near the back of the room with an expression Holloway couldn't fully read and wasn't sure he wanted to. Shaw was the reason Rachel Bennett's personnel file had a flag on it. She'd been on the review board that evaluated the Arizona incident. Holloway knew that. He also knew because Cole had told him quietly in the 2 minutes since the convoy started moving that what had happened in Arizona was more complicated than a straightforward insubordination case. That records had been adjusted. That a junior officer had taken more responsibility than the evidence supported. That Rachel Bennett had submitted cockpit recordings that directly contradicted the official finding, and that she had paid for it with 6 years of stalled advancement and a reputation that preceded her into every room she walked into. Holloway pressed transmit. Rook 1, 30 seconds, in and out. You report immediately on egress. Over. Copy that. Rook 1 descending, out. In the staging area, the convoy had stopped. Maya climbed out of the second vehicle and stood in the open, head tilted up, listening. The sound of the A-10's engines was somewhere above and ahead. Then it shifted, dropped in pitch, and grew louder in a way that meant the aircraft was coming down through the smoke toward them. Gutierrez, the lead vehicle driver, stepped out beside her. He was 23 years old and had never been this close to a wildfire in his life. He'd been driving on instinct and instruction for the last 12 minutes, trusting the voice on the radio, the way you trust a doctor when you're in a hospital and the diagnosis is serious and you have no idea what anything means except that someone who does know is telling you what to do. Is she coming through the smoke? He said. She's checking the forward route, Maya said. Can she see in there? She's looking with her eyes and a thermal sensor and 15 years of doing this. Yeah. Maya paused. She can see. Gutierrez looked up at the smoke. Is she going to be okay? Maya didn't answer immediately because Maya was honest, and the honest answer was that she didn't know. The honest answer was that Rachel was making a choice that carried real risk and doing it for 12 people she'd never met because it was the right thing to do, and that the only way to respond to that kind of choice was to be worthy of it. Get back in the vehicle, Maya said. Be ready to move the second she calls. At 400 feet above the canyon floor, Rachel's A-10 was in the turbulence zone where fire-heated air met canyon walls and created the kind of rolling instability that makes aircraft feel like they're being handled by something angry and enormous. She kept her hands relaxed on the controls. Tight hands fight the turbulence and lose. Relaxed hands absorb it and adapt. And she worked the cockpit instruments against what her eyes were showing her. The thermal sensor painted the ground below her in heat signatures. The road she was looking for showed as a cooler stripe against the warmer desert floor, a thin pale line running north by northwest, exactly where the paper chart suggested it should be. Then she saw the problem. A utility pole had come down across the road. Not from the fire. The pole had been standing for years, rotted at the base, and the turbulence from the storm had finished what decades of desert weather had started. It lay across the route at a 45-degree angle, and it was burning. Not exploding, not dramatically consumed, just burning at the base where it had fallen into dry brush, steady and patient and absolute. The road was blocked. Rachel pulled up through the smoke and keyed the radio before she'd fully cleared the haze layer. Guardian 6 Rook 1. The Northern Service Road is blocked. Repeat, blocked. Fallen utility pole burning. It is not passable for your vehicles. Over. The silence from the ground lasted 4 seconds. Then Mercer's voice. Copy that, Rook 1. What are our options? Over. Back at Nellis, Holloway asked the same question to his operations staff. 3 people answered at once with 3 different things, and none of them were useful because they were all working from the same outdated digital map that had been misleading them for the last 30 minutes. Shaw stepped forward from the back of the room. Colonel Holloway. Her voice carried the particular authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. I think it's time to follow the emergency extraction checklist. We coordinate with the helicopter crews, establish a staging orbit, and wait for satellite imagery to update before committing Guardian 6 to any additional movement. Holloway looked at her. General, the team has at most 12 minutes before fire encroachment becomes critical. The satellite update won't arrive in 12 minutes. The checklist exists for a reason. We follow procedure, or we set a precedent that individual judgment supersedes command authority. That is not a precedent this institution can afford. With respect, General. Holloway stopped himself. He looked at the screen. He looked at the clock. He thought about Cole's quiet words from 15 minutes ago. Records adjusted. Junior officer took extra responsibility. Cockpit recordings contradicted the official finding. I thought about a woman flying a 30-year-old aircraft through smoke and turbulence to reach 12 people she'd never met, and doing it while still asking permission, still respecting authority, still working within a structure that had spent 6 years telling her she wasn't good enough. Respectfully, General Shaw, he said, the checklist is guidance. The people on the ground are not a variable in a procedural review. They are 12 human beings with a clock running. Shaw met his eyes. Something moved behind hers. She didn't respond. Price's voice broke the tension. Colonel, I found it. He was holding a printed page, a scanned maintenance report dated 12 years earlier. His hands were not quite steady. There's an abandoned aircraft maintenance strip on the northwest side of the canyon, accessed via a crossing at the drainage channel, then up a slope. The corridor was marked clear by ordnance disposal in the same survey. It's not in the digital database because it was decommissioned, but it's there. He looked up, and it's large enough for helicopters to land. Rachel heard this over the command channel because Holloway had done something smart 20 minutes ago without realizing it. He'd put the command frequency on the aircraft's primary radio instead of secondary, which meant Rachel was hearing everything in real time. She heard Price read the coordinates. She cross-referenced them on her paper chart in approximately 3 seconds. She keyed the radio. Nellis Command Rook 1, I can see the approach to that maintenance strip from my current altitude. It is accessible. The drainage crossing is shallow. The slope is steep but manageable. I need to lead the convoy there. And I need the helicopters on standby to begin their approach as soon as I can mark the landing zone. Over. Holloway looked at the clock. 11 minutes. 11 minutes before fire encroachment became unsurvivable. He looked at Shaw. She looked at him. The room held its breath. Holloway turned to his helicopter coordination officer. Get the Pave Hawks moving. Tell them to approach from the east hold outside the canyon until Rook 1 gives a visual clear. Move. Then he pressed transmit. Rook 1 Nellis Command, you are authorized to lead the convoy. Coordinate the approach and mark the landing zone. We have helicopters inbound. Over. Rachel's response was immediate. No pause this time. Copy that, Colonel. Moving now. Guardian 6, this is Rook 1. Follow my wings. I'm going to fly the route ahead of you, and I want your lead vehicle to track my wingtip. When I bank left, you go left. When I level you, hold course. Don't use your GPS. It's unreliable. You watch me. Copy. Maya was already at the lead vehicle window. Gutierrez looked at her. She's going to fly the route and we follow her, Maya said. You watch the wingtip. Don't think, don't navigate. You just follow that wing. Gutierrez swallowed once. Copy. The convoy moved, and the next 9 minutes were the kind that redefined the rest of a person's life. Rachel flew the route at an altitude low enough that the smoke occasionally thinned around her fuselage and the ground team could track her visually. She banked at each turn with a deliberateness that was slightly exaggerated, not sloppy, but extended, holding the bank a half-second longer than she normally would to make the direction unmistakable for the people on the ground trying to follow her through a canyon they couldn't fully see. At the drainage crossing, she made a low pass and rocked her wings a signal she had described to Maya in a quick radio exchange. 30 seconds earlier, 2 rocks meant the surface was firm. 1 rock meant proceed with caution. She rocked twice. The first vehicle crossed without incident. The second crossed without incident. The third vehicle, the one carrying Sergeant Cole, the man with the fractured femur, the man who could not walk, reached the middle of the drainage channel and stopped. The wheels spun in wet sand. The vehicle did not move forward. The front tires dug down instead of gripping. The driver, a young specialist named Ortega, who'd been driving in silence for the entire crisis because there was nothing useful to say, tried. Forward, tried, reverse, tried again. The vehicle rocked but didn't advance. Behind them, the fire had crossed their previous position. They could hear it clearly now. Not the romantic crackle of a campfire. The real sound of wildfire in a canyon, a continuous, deep, textured roar that contains inside it the sound of individual trees and brush, and the occasional sharp report of something explosive, an old fence post, a metal container left on the range years ago, popping in the heat. Mercer's voice on the radio was controlled, but stripped down to the essential. Rook 1 Vehicle 3 is stuck in the drainage crossing. Over. Rachel banked hard. She came back over the crossing with the A-10 at the lowest altitude she'd flown all day. She looked at the vehicle. She looked at the sand around it. She saw what Ortega couldn't see from the driver's seat, a line of harder packed earth approximately 4 meters to the left, where ancient flood sediment had compacted differently, firmer. The color was slightly different if you knew what to look for, and Rachel had grown up on desert ground, and she knew. Guardian 6 Rook 1, tell your driver to go hard left, not slight left, hard left 4 meters. And there is a firm surface. He will feel it the moment the tires hit it. Go left, now over. Maya relayed it with one hand already on the vehicle door. Ortega cranked the wheel hard. The vehicle skidded sideways, front tires catching nothing, then everything a sudden lurching grip as the rubber found the compacted sediment. The vehicle climbed out of the drainage channel. The entire convoy was across, but the slope ahead was steep, steeper than anything they'd driven today, steeper than the gradient in the maintenance report. Steep enough that Gutierrez in the lead vehicle took one look at it and understood why Rachel had told them to watch her wings and not think. Because if he'd thought about this slope in advance, he might have found reasons to doubt it. He didn't think. He drove. The lead vehicle climbed, slowly, struggling. The engine sound changed to the grinding, low-gear labor of something working at its limit. But it climbed. The second vehicle followed. Vehicle 3, carrying a coal, carrying the weight of the entire team's hope, in a very real sense began the slope and immediately lost traction. The rear tires spun on loose sand. The vehicle slid sideways. Ortega compensated. It slid back. He compensated again. The vehicle was climbing and slipping, simultaneously moving forward 1 meter for every half meter of slide, and every second of that process was burning time the team didn't have. Rachel saw it from above. She was watching the slope the way a surgeon watches a procedure, fully present, fully committed, every other thought cleared out of the way. She made another low pass. Her wingtip vortices the invisible currents of disturbed air that trail behind any aircraft's wingtips pushed down and outward as she cleared the slope. The smoke thinned for 3 seconds, just 3. But in those 3 seconds, Maya Torres, watching from the maintenance strip, where the first 2 vehicles had already arrived, saw a strip of darker ground running along the left edge of the slope. She keyed the radio instantly. Ortega, hard left. There's firmer ground on the left edge. Do it now. He did it. The vehicle found the edge. The tires held. It climbed the last 40 meters in one continuous laboring push, and when it reached the top of the slope and rolled onto the flat surface of the maintenance strip, Ortega stopped the vehicle, put it in park, and sat with both hands on the wheel and said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then he said, "Tell her she's got eyes like a hawk." Maya was already on the radio. Rook 1 Guardian 6. All vehicles are on the maintenance strip. All personnel accounted for. We are at the landing zone. Where are my helicopters? Over. Rachel was already climbing. She punched through the smoke layer and into clear air and immediately began the radio sequence to bring the helicopters in. Nellis command, Rook 1 is clear of the smoke. I have the maintenance strip visual. The LZ is clear. Bring the Pave Hawks in from the east. Follow my lead. I'll guide them through the canyon approach. Over. At Nellis, the helicopter coordination officer was already talking to the lead Pave Hawk crew. The commander of the first helicopter, a veteran warrant officer named Haynes who'd flown 2 combat tours, heard Rachel's voice and said, I've got Rook 1's position. Tell her to lead and we'll follow. We trust her eyes. That trust had not been asked for. It had been earned in the last 30 minutes by a pilot who had not once overestimated her ability, not once promised more than she could deliver, and not once abandoned the people on the ground, even when ordered to pull back. Haynes had been on the command frequency the entire time. He'd heard every exchange. He didn't need a briefing. He followed the A-10 into the canyon. Rachel flew the approach, with the 2 helicopters behind her descending through the smoke in a sequence that the Pave Hawk crews would later describe in their own debrief as the most precise visual approach guidance they'd ever followed without formal instrument procedures. She kept her speed down and her turns gradual flying for the aircraft behind her rather than for herself. The first helicopter landed on the maintenance strip. The medical team was out before the rotor wash settled. They reached Sergeant Cole in 40 seconds. 11 members of Guardian 6 began boarding the first aircraft. Mercer and Maya held back. They were securing Cole's litter, coordinating the load, doing the work that leadership does when everyone else is getting to safety. The last work, the unglamorous work, the work that means you leave when everyone else has left and not a moment before. The wind shifted. It happened the way wind always shifts in a canyon wildfire, without warning, without courtesy, without any consideration for the human calculations that have been built around its previous behavior. It pushed the fire across the eastern edge of the maintenance strip, which meant the second helicopter now had a wall of heat on one side of its intended approach path. The Pave Hawk crew aborted the first approach. They pulled up and climbed in, circling outside the canyon, while the crew commander talked fast with Haynes and the coordination team at Nellis. On the maintenance strip, Mercer heard the helicopter pull up. He looked at Maya. She looked at him. How long before they can come back? He said. Depends on the wind, she said. Could be 3 minutes, could be 7. He looked at where the fire had moved. He looked at where it was going. He didn't say what they were both calculating. He didn't need to. At Nellis, Holloway was watching the camera feed from the now repositioned range safety drone. The image was clearer than before the smoke had thinned at altitude, and he could see the maintenance strip, the vehicles, the 2 figures standing near a vehicle, while the first helicopter lifted with its load. He could see the fire. He could see the math. Rook 1, he said, and his voice had changed. It had lost the formal authority it carried at the beginning of this crisis. It had become the voice of a man talking to someone he trusted. What is your fuel state? Over. A pause. I have enough for 2 passes and a return to base with reserve. Over. 1 more pass and then you come home. That's an order. Over. Understood, sir. Over. He watched the screen. He watched the fire. He watched 2 people standing on a strip of desert ground that was running out of time. Then he heard Maya Torres on the ground frequency. Rook 1, we need that second helicopter. Mercer is still on the strip. Sergeant Cole is transferred, but Captain Mercer stayed behind to coordinate the load. He's here with me. The LZ window is closing. Over. Rachel answered before Holloway could. Guardian 6, I'm coming. Out. And she turned back. She turned back with a fuel warning already active in her cockpit, not critical yet, but close enough that any experienced pilot would have started a direct course to base instead of banking back toward a smoke-filled canyon. She turned back because Maya Torres had said, Mercer is still on the strip, and Rachel Bennett had been the kind of pilot for 15 years who did not leave people on the strip. Holloway did not order her to abort. He pressed transmit. Rook 1, you are authorized for 1 final pass. Bring the helicopter in, and then you come home. Over. Copy that, Colonel. Thank you. Over. She entered the canyon for the last time. The second Pave Hawk crew saw the A-10 appear below them through the smoke descending into the narrow approach corridor with its navigation lights on, and its speed dropped back to the minimum that kept it airborne. The helicopter commander watched and simply followed. Rachel flew between the approaching fire and the ridgeline, absorbing the turbulence in her airframe, creating a corridor of relative stability directly behind her. The Pavehawk followed her down. It touched the maintenance strip with 40 seconds to spare before the fire crossed the eastern edge completely. Mercer and Maya climbed aboard. They climbed aboard because Rachel was in the canyon giving them a door to walk through, and they walked through it. The helicopter lifted. Rachel pulled up hard through the smoke, her fuel warning sounding now. In continuous tone, the aircraft shaking in the heat as she climbed. She broke into clear air above the canyon, and for 1 second she could see everything below her. The fire consuming the maintenance strip. She'd led 12 people off of the 2 helicopters climbing away from it, the smoke rising in a column that would be visible for miles. All 12. She didn't transmit immediately. She leveled her wings, checked her fuel, and calculated her return to base with the precise efficiency of someone who has learned to give everything up to the last margin and not a drop more. Then she keyed the radio. Nellis Command Rook 1, Guardian 6 is clear. All 12 personnel are airborne. I am returning to base. Over. The command center at Nellis Air Force Base did not erupt the way movie rooms erupt, with everyone shouting at once and chaos translating into joy. It went quiet first. The specific quiet of a room full of people who have been holding their breath for a long time and are only now allowing themselves to exhale. Cole sat down. He hadn't realized until that moment that he'd been standing for the last 20 minutes. Price released a long breath and looked at the floor. Holloway stood with both hands flat on the table and his head down for a moment. Just a moment. And then he straightened up. He looked at the screen. He looked at the shape of an A-10 on the radar display moving south toward Nellis, low on fuel intact. He thought about what he'd said 2 hours ago. Museum piece. I thought about the sound that had rolled over the command center before anyone could respond. The unmistakable roar of those engines turning toward the north, toward the smoke, toward 12 people that the newest and most advanced aircraft in the inventory hadn't been able to reach. Shaw was still standing at the back of the room. Holloway turned and looked at her. She met his eyes. Whatever conversation they were going to have about Rachel Bennett and the Arizona incident, in the review board, in the personnel file, was not going to happen today in this room in front of observers. But it was going to happen. Shaw knew that. She could see it in the way he looked at her. At the secondary terminal, Owen Price pulled up Rachel's personnel record one more time. He looked at the disciplinary flag. He looked at the transfer notation. He looked at the promotion recommendation that had been quietly withdrawn 6 years ago. He looked at the radar blip heading south. He printed the record. He folded it precisely in half. He put it in his breast pocket. I didn't know yet what he would do with it, but he understood with a clarity that only comes from watching something real happen in real time that what was in that document and what he had watched happen in the last 2 hours were describing 2 completely different people, and that only one of those descriptions was true. In the sky south of the canyon, Rachel Bennett flew her A-10 at minimum fuel and maximum composure. Her hands were steady on the controls. Her breathing was even. The canyon was behind her, and it would stay behind her for the rest of her life, in the particular way that places you've survived tend to stay behind. You never quite absent, never quite threatening, just there, part of the architecture of who you've become. She thought about Cole, about whether the leg was going to heal cleanly, about whether Ortega had ever driven anything that steep before, and whether he'd be able to sleep tonight. About Maya Torres and the specific quality of calm she'd heard in Maya's voice on the radio. The voice of someone who'd been scared and had decided not to let fear make decisions for her. She thought about Holloway, about the word he hadn't said but had almost certainly thought, about the record that had followed her from one assignment to the next, like a shadow she'd learned to stop trying to outrun. She thought about the moment he'd said, "You are authorized." Not a vindication, not an apology, just permission arriving exactly when it mattered from a man who'd looked at an impossible situation and decided to trust the person in the aircraft rather than the screen on the wall. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, almost everything. The runway at Nellis appeared below her, and she began her approach. Her fuel warning was still sounding. She had enough. She always had exactly enough. She landed with the fuel warning still sounding. That detail, that continuous flat electronic tone that filled the cockpit for the last 4 minutes of her approach was something Rachel would think about later in the quiet of the hours after everything was over. Not with fear, With a kind of clear-eyed inventory, she had gone to the edge of what the aircraft could give her, and the aircraft had given it. That was the deal. That had always been the deal between a pilot and a machine that people kept telling her was too old to matter. The A-10 rolled out on the runway at Nellis, and Rachel brought it to a stop with the professional economy of movement that experienced pilots develop when their hands are too tired for anything extra. She shut down the left engine, then the right. The turbines wound down with the gradual descending whine that always reminded her of something finishing a long task. The cockpit went quiet. She sat for a moment, just a moment. Outside fire crews were already surrounding the aircraft. 2 maintenance technicians were moving toward the fuselage. A ground safety officer was standing by the nose with a clipboard because protocol required an inspection anytime an aircraft had operated under the kinds of heat and turbulence Rachel had put this one through. She unstrapped her harness. She pulled off her helmet. She climbed down. The flight line was not quiet. Word travels fast on a military base when something real has happened, and in the time it had taken Rachel to fly back from the canyon, the story had already moved from the command center through the operations building and out onto the flight line in the fragmented, half-accurate, emotionally correct way that stories move when they carry weight. Pilots knew, mechanics knew, ground crew knew, not the details not yet, but the shape of the thing. That an A-10 had gone into the smoke, that 12 people had come out. They were standing along the edge of the taxiway when Rachel walked past. Not in a formal line, not at attention, just standing there the way people stand when they want to acknowledge something they don't have words for. Rachel didn't look at them directly. She was still working something through in her head, something that needed processing before she could accept what was being offered. She walked with her helmet under her arm and her flight suit damp with the sweat of 2 hours of hard work. And she looked at the ground in front of her the way she always did when her mind was still in the sky. Colonel Holloway met her beside the aircraft. He was standing alone. Cole was 20 feet behind him, close enough to witness, but far enough to give them space. Price was further back still near the edge of the operations building, holding a folded piece of paper in both hands with the care of someone who has decided that a document is important enough to protect. Rachel stopped walking when she saw Holloway. She came to attention out of habit, the reflex of 15 years, the thing your body does when your commanding officer is standing in front of you, regardless of what the circumstances are. Holloway shook his head once. At ease, Major. She relaxed. She waited. Her expression was careful and contained the expression of someone who has learned through experience that the moments after something important are often more dangerous than the thing itself. Institutional consequence had a way of arriving precisely when you thought the crisis was over. Holloway looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, I was wrong. Rachel said nothing. My first call when Price told me you were airborne. I dismissed the aircraft and I dismissed you, and I did it because of this. He paused. Because of what I thought I knew, not what I actually knew. Sir, let me finish. He wasn't harsh about it. He was just precise. I made a judgment based on what something looked like instead of what it could do. I've been doing that for long enough that I stopped noticing I was doing it. Today it almost cost 12 people their lives. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know that I understand that, not as a procedural footnote. I understand it. Rachel looked at him. She looked at the man in front of her, the rank on his collar, the exercise command band on his arm, the posture of someone who had built his career on a version of the world that this afternoon had forced him to revise. She had met men like Holloway before. She had been burned by men like Holloway before. But she had also over 15 years learned to distinguish between the ones who used authority to avoid accountability and the ones who used it to discharge it. Holloway was doing the second thing right now. Imperfectly, awkwardly, late but doing it. Are all 12 safe? She said. Yes, Cole is en route to the base hospital. Surgeons are already waiting. Rains is being evaluated for smoke inhalation. Everyone else is on the ground and accounted for. The tension left her face. Not dramatically, there was no collapse, no flooding relief, just a subtle shift, the kind that happens when a person who has been holding something very heavy is allowed to set it down. She exhaled once slowly. Then it worked, she said. That's what matters. Holloway looked at her for another moment. He had expected something else, not gratitude exactly, but perhaps a softening, an opening, the kind of emotional response that a person offers when they've just been told they were right. Instead, she'd asked about the team. Instead, she'd reduced the entire last 2 hours to the one outcome that justified them. I thought about 6 years. He thought about a promotion recommendation that had been quietly removed from a file. He thought about what Cole had told him in the operations room and what Price had not yet said, but was clearly preparing to say. "There are things we need to discuss," he said. "Not now, but soon, about your record." "Sir, I appreciate that, but with respect today, I'd rather have a cup of bad coffee in a quiet corner than a conversation about my personnel file." Something shifted in Holloway's expression. It might have been the beginning of something like respect arriving at a layer deeper than professional acknowledgement. That, he said, is a reasonable request. He stepped aside. She walked past him toward the operations building. Behind her, Cole let out a breath so long it seemed like he'd been holding it for the better part of an hour. Price watched Rachel walk past. She glanced at him briefly, the kind of glance that takes in a person and moves on, and then she was gone through the door. Price looked down at the folded document in his hands. He looked at Cole. "When do we bring this forward?" he said quietly, meaning the personnel record, meaning the maintenance report from Arizona, meaning all of it. Cole looked at the door Rachel had gone through. "Give her the coffee first," he said. Inside the operations building, the debrief was already being organized. This was standard procedure after any exercise incident, a formal review of the timeline, the decisions, the communications, the outcomes. It would be recorded, transcribed, and submitted to the Air Force Safety Center. Normally, this was a routine administrative process. This was not going to be routine. Brigadier General Evelyn Shaw understood that before anyone said it out loud. She was standing in the command center when Holloway came back through the door, and the expression she wore was the expression of a senior officer calculating several different possible futures simultaneously and trying to determine which one she could manage. She had served on the review board 6 years ago. She had signed the document that formalized the finding against Rachel Bennett. She had not falsified anything that was important, and she was precise about it in her own mind, but she had allowed a conclusion to stand that the cockpit recordings did not fully support because the alternative was a finding that implicated decisions made by people above her in the chain of command, and she had been 48 years old and 3 years from a third star, and the calculus of that moment had been what it was. She had not thought about it often. She had thought about it enough. She thought about it now with considerably more focus. Holloway came to stand beside her. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the main display where the radar tracks of the two Pavehawks were converging on the base hospital's landing pad, carrying the last of Guardian 6 home. "General," he said. "Colonel, the formal review begins at 0800 tomorrow. I've requested that Major Bennett be present. I'm also requesting a full communications record, including the command frequency exchanges from this afternoon." Shaw was quiet for a moment. "That will include the exchange where I recommended following the checklist," she said. "Yes, ma'am, it will." Another pause. "It will also include the exchange where you overrode that recommendation," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Shaw looked at the screen. She was 61 years old. She had 33 years of service. She had made good decisions under pressure, and she had made compromised decisions under different kinds of pressure, and she had carried both sets with her in the way that any person who has been honest with herself carries the weight of who she's actually been versus who she intended to be. "I'll be at the review," she said. "I'd like you to be more than present," Holloway said carefully. "I'd like your full cooperation." Shaw turned and looked at him. The look lasted longer than comfort required. "You're asking me to reopen something," she said. "I'm asking you to correct something," he said. "There's a difference." He walked away from her. At the base hospital, Captain Noah Mercer was sitting on a bench outside the trauma bay where Sergeant Cole was being assessed. He had smoke in his lungs that a nurse had told him needed to be evaluated, and he had a superficial burn on his right forearm from a piece of burning debris that had landed on him during the final push to the maintenance strip. And he had been awake for 19 hours and had just survived the kind of afternoon that people spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately to people who weren't there. I was looking at his hands. Maya Torres sat down next to him. She handed him a bottle of water. He took it without looking up. "She never left us," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Maya said. "Even when they told her to hold, even when Holloway ordered her to stay at altitude, she stayed within her orders," Maya said. "She asked permission before every critical step, but she also never stopped working the problem." Maya paused. "That's the part I keep thinking about. She wasn't defying command. She was showing command what the problem actually was. Mercer took a drink of water. He looked at the burn on his forearm. He thought about the moment when the second helicopter had aborted its first approach, and he and Maya had been standing on the maintenance strip watching the fire move toward them from the east, calculating in their heads how much time they had, and then hearing that engine sound dropping back into the canyon. She came back, with a fuel warning sounding, with one more pass left in what the aircraft could give her. She came back. "I want to find her," he said. "I want to say something to her." "She's in the operations building," Maya said. "Give her a little while." What do you say to someone like that? Maya thought about this for a moment. She thought about the radio voice she'd been following all afternoon, calm and precise, and never once overclaiming, never once promising safety. She couldn't deliver, just staying, just being there, just keeping the channel open so that the 12 of them knew there was still a connection between them and the sky. "I think," Maya said, "you say thank you, and then you let her know that it mattered. Not just that we survived, that the way she did it mattered." Mercer nodded slowly. "I thought about the plaque they'd give her, some official recognition, a commendation written in the formal language of institutions, translating the afternoon's events into the vocabulary of military achievement. He thought about how inadequate that would be, and how she probably knew it would be inadequate and wouldn't care because people like Rachel Bennett didn't do what she'd done this afternoon for the plaque. They did it because 12 people needed to come home, and she was the one who could get them there. At 8:40 that evening, Cole found Rachel in the corner of the officer's lounge with a cup of coffee she hadn't finished and a paper-ranged chart spread on the table in front of her. She was marking something on the chart with a pencil, and she didn't look up when Cole sat down across from her. He waited. She made one more mark, then she folded the chart and put it in her breast pocket. 6 years ago, Cole said without preamble, the Arizona Review Board made a finding. I was peripherally involved, not on the board, but I consulted on the communications records. I've been thinking about that since the moment I recognized your name today. Rachel looked at him. I want you to know, he said, that I reviewed the cockpit recordings you submitted. The ones that showed the original route had command approval. And I want you to know that I wrote a memo to the reviewing officer indicating that the recordings were inconsistent with the preliminary finding. Rachel said nothing. The memo was received, Cole said, and then it was set aside. And I didn't push harder than that. I filed it and I moved on. He stopped. That was the wrong choice. And I've known it was the wrong choice for 6 years. The lounge was quiet. Someone had left a television on in the corner with the volume off, and the muted light from it moved across Cole's face in irregular patterns. Why are you telling me now? Rachel said. Her voice was even. Not cold, just careful, the way it always was when she was working out whether to trust something. Because tomorrow at 0800 there's going to be a formal review, because Holloway has requested the full communications record, because Price has already located the original Arizona maintenance report and has been cross-referencing it with your submitted recordings. Cole paused. And because I'm going to put something in writing before that review that I should have put in writing 6 years ago. Rachel looked at the table. She looked at it for a long time. David, she said, using his first name for the first time in the conversation, something that shifted the register of the exchange from professional to human. I spent 3 years after Arizona believing that if I just filed the report and walked away, if I just let the findings stand, I would have made colonel by now. I'd have a squadron. I'd have done more good for more people from a position that actually had resources. She looked up at him. I used to run that calculation in my head on bad days. What I traded for being right. Cole didn't look away from her. And on good days, he said. She was quiet for a moment. On good days, I knew that the junior controller they were trying to put it on was 24 years old and had a family and had followed the approved route exactly as directed. And I knew that I had recordings that proved it. And I knew that if I walked away, nobody was going to find those recordings in a drawer somewhere and fix it later. She upped her coffee cup. On good days, it was simple. Cole nodded. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a handwritten memo dated today, time-stamped from 40 minutes ago. He placed it on the table between them. Rachel looked at it. She didn't pick it up. Is this for the review? She said. It's for the record, he said, which is the same thing. She picked it up. She read it. It was 4 paragraphs. It was the clearest, most direct document she had ever seen a senior officer produce about their own error of omission. It named names. It cited dates. It stated conclusions without softening them. She set it back down on the table. You know this is going to create problems, she said. Yes. Shaw is going to push back. Probably, P. Holloway is going to be put in a difficult position. He put himself in it when he decided to do the right thing, Cole said. Same as you did. Same as I'm doing now. He paused. The company we keep, Major Bennett. Something moved in Rachel's expression. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that exists in the space just before a person decides to trust something they'd stopped trusting. Owen Price, she said, the young lieutenant. Is he going to be protected through this? Cole blinked. He had not expected that to be her first question about the review. He had expected her to ask about her own record, her own promotion, her own position. He's going to be fine, Cole said. Holloway has already made clear that Price is being credited for identifying the available asset. He should be commissioned in the room tomorrow, Rachel said. Not in a memo, in the room. Publicly, what he did took more courage than most people understand. He was the most junior person in that command center, and he said the thing nobody wanted to hear. She paused. That's the thing we need to protect. Not me, not you. That instinct in a 26-year-old lieutenant to stand up in a room full of senior officers and point at the aircraft everyone's ignoring. Cole looked at her. I thought about 30 years of military service and the things he'd understood about leadership at various points along the way. He thought about the memos he'd written and the ones he hadn't. He thought about the difference between the two. I'll make sure of it, he said. In the command center, which had been quiet for 2 hours, Shaw was still working through something. She was alone at the main display, not looking at the screen, but standing near it, the way people stand near things when they're using the proximity to think, rather than the object itself. One of the exercise observers had tried to speak with her an hour ago, and she dismissed him with 3 words and a look that ended the conversation before it started. She was 61 years old. She had made a decision 6 years ago that she had told herself was pragmatic, that the institution was more important than any individual case, that protecting a chain of command that was mostly functioning well was worth the friction of one imperfect finding, that Rachel Bennett was a good pilot and talented officers survived career setbacks and came back stronger. She had told herself these things enough times that she had stopped examining whether they were true. Well, today had forced the examination. She had watched in real time what Rachel Bennett actually was. Not the personnel file, not the damaged reputation. The actual human being in an actual aircraft making actual decisions under actual pressure. She had watched a woman fly into smoke to save 12 people and do it with a discipline and precision and ethical clarity that Shaw had rarely seen in 3 decades of evaluating military performance. And she had watched herself stand in that room and recommend following the checklist. Memory of those words. Her own words had been sitting in her chest for the last 2 hours with the specific weight of something you cannot give back. She picked up her phone. She called her aide. Get me the Arizona case file, she said, the full record. I want it on my desk in 20 minutes. A pause. The original, not the summary. The aide started to ask a clarifying question. The original, she said again, 20 minutes. She set the phone down. This was the thing about accountability that institutions had difficulty with, not the accountability itself, but the timing of it. The right moment to correct something was always in the past. The second right moment was now. And every moment after now was a moment in which the error continued. She had missed the first right moment. She was not going to miss the second one. At Nini 15, Mercer and Maya found Rachel walking the flight line. She'd gone out after the conversation with Cole, not to avoid anything, but because she needed open air and the particular quality of darkness that exists on a military flight line at night, the combination of amber ground lighting and black sky and the shapes of aircraft that feel different when they're not moving. She heard them before she saw them. Mercer's boots on the tarmac and Maya's lighter step beside him. She stopped walking. Mercer stopped 3 feet from her. He was still in his field uniform, which was stained with smoke, and had a field dressing on his right forearm. He looked like a man who had been through something and hadn't yet had time to become the story of it. He said, Major Bennett, Captain Mercer. I want to. He stopped. He'd been rehearsing this for 2 hours, and now the words he'd prepared seemed too formal and too thin for the weight of what he needed them to carry. I want you to know that we heard you the entire time, the whole team, Every time you came over, every time your voice was on the radio, it mattered. Not just the navigation, the voice. He paused. The fact that you kept coming back. Rachel looked at him. Gutierrez told me to tell you, he continued, that you have eyes like a hawk. He wanted it officially on the record. Something happened in Rachel's expression then. The contained composure she'd been wearing since she landed, the deliberate professional calm of someone who has learned to manage how much she shows, shifted enough that the human being inside it became visible. "How's Cole?" she said. "In surgery. They said the fracture is clean. No arterial involvement. He's going to be fine." Rachel nodded. "And Rains?" "Smoke inhalation is mild. They were keeping him overnight for observation, but he's already arguing with the nurses, so the prognosis is good." She made a sound that was close to a laugh. "That's a good sign." Maya stepped forward. She was holding something, a small, dark object, roughly circular, the size of a challenge coin, but not a coin. Rachel looked at it and recognized it after a moment. A unit patch. Guardian 6's patch. It was scorched on one edge, actually scorched, blackened from heat, not symbolic but real, because Maya had been wearing it on her jacket when the fire crossed the end of the maintenance strip and the heat had caught the edge of the cloth. Maya held it out. "The systems lost us," she said. "Every screen, every satellite, every network they spent 2 years building and 3 months telling us was the future." She paused. "You didn't lose us." Rachel looked at the patch. She looked at Maya. She thought about 12 people following her wings through smoke and heat in a canyon that the most advanced digital systems in the American military had failed to navigate. She took the patch. She held it in her closed hand for a moment, feeling the rough edge where the fire had touched it. "I need you to do something," she said. Both of them looked at her. "Not tonight, but when the formal review happens tomorrow. I need both of you to tell the truth about what worked and what didn't. Not to protect me, not to protect command, the truth. Because if we don't document this, exactly what failed and exactly why it happens again. Different canyon, different team, same 12 people who needed information that the system wasn't giving them." Mercer looked at her steadily. "Done." Maya looked at the burnt patch in Rachel's hand. "Done," she said. Rachel nodded. She looked up at the sky where the storm that had started in all of this was still moving east. And in its wake, the Nevada stars were coming out in the particular way they do over desert at altitude, sharp and dense. The kind of sky that reminds you that the universe is very large and the problems of any given afternoon are exactly as significant as the people involved choose to make them. She thought about tomorrow, about the formal review, about Shaw and Holloway and Cole's memo and the conversations that were going to happen in rooms with chairs, in recording equipment, in the specific institutional weight of the United States Air Force trying to sort out what had happened today and what it meant. She thought about the A-10 sitting on the flight line behind her, smelling of smoke and hot metal and turbine exhaust. She thought about the plaque that would never fully capture it, and she thought about Price, 26 years old, standing at an auxiliary terminal in a room full of people who outranked him, saying the one true thing nobody else was willing to say. And she felt something that she recognized after a moment as hope. Not the passive kind, the active kind. The kind that comes from seeing something real in a person and knowing that the thing you saw will still be there tomorrow and the day after. She opened her hand and looked at the scorched patch. "Go get some rest," she said to Mercer and Maya. "Both of you. You need it." "What about you?" Maya said. Rachel looked at the aircraft. "I need to write a few things down while they're clear," she said. "And then I need to call my uncle." Maya looked at her. "Smoke jumper," Rachel said. "He taught me how to read fire. I call him after every hard day." She paused. "He's going to ask me if I came home with everyone." She was quiet for a moment. "This time I get to say yes." The call to her uncle lasted 43 minutes. Rachel made it from a bench outside the operations building, where the night air carried the last traces of the storm moving east, and the flight line was quiet enough that she could hear her own breathing between sentences. Her uncle, a man named Frank, who was 67 years old and still spent 3 months every summer on fire lines in California, because as he had told Rachel more than once, the fires didn't stop needing people who understood them. Just because those people got older, listened to the whole story without interrupting. That was the thing about Frank. He always listened to the whole story. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The drainage crossing," he said, "the hard-packed sediment to the left. How did you see it?" Color difference, she said, and the way the water drains in those formations. You taught me that. Ancient flood sediment compacts differently. The color's a shade darker when you know what to look for. From 400 feet, he said, in smoke. It was thin at that point. Frank made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more serious. Rach, you know what your problem is? I have a feeling you're going to tell me. Your problem is you keep thinking that what you do is normal, that any other pilot would have seen that it's the aircraft or the training or luck. He paused. It's not any of those things. It's 30 years of learning to look. First at fires from a hillside with me, then from a cockpit, and you never stopped learning. Another pause. Did they all come home? All 12. Frank was quiet for 3 full seconds. Good, Wendy said. Call me after the review tomorrow. She sat on that bench for another 10 minutes after she hung up, thinking about the word learning, about what it meant to accumulate knowledge over 30 years versus what it meant to have information delivered to you through a screen, about the difference between knowing and understanding, about a 26-year-old lieutenant standing at an auxiliary terminal who had understood something that experienced officers had missed. She went inside and wrote for 2 hours. Not a report, not yet, just notes. The kind of notes a person makes when they need to get something out of their head and onto paper before the institution translates it into something flatter. She wrote about the drainage crossing and the sediment and the color difference. She wrote about the service road that appeared in a 12-year-old paper maintenance report and not in any digital system. She wrote about the moment the network displayed a clear northern corridor while fire burned across it. She wrote about what it meant to be carrying paper charts when everyone else had stopped. At 2:17 in the morning, she stopped writing and went to sleep. At 6:45, she was back in uniform. The formal review convened at 0800 in the primary briefing room at Nellis, and it was not the kind of review anyone had organized in advance, because nobody had known yesterday morning that it would be necessary. It was assembled in the 12 hours between the end of the crisis and the beginning of this meeting, from the raw material of what had actually happened. Communications records, radar tracks, camera footage from the range safety drone, cockpit, data from Rachel's aircraft, medical reports on Cole and Rain's maintenance assessments of the A-10 and Cole's handwritten memo, which had been typed and submitted to the review coordinator at 0630 and had already been read by everyone in the room before they sat down. Holloway opened the review. He was standing at the front of the room, not at a podium, just standing in the space between the display screen and the first row of chairs, which was the choice of a man who wanted no barrier between himself and what he was about to say. Before we begin the formal record, he said, I want to state something for the transcript. Yesterday at approximately 11:52, I made a judgment that dismissed an available asset based on the age of the aircraft and the reputation of its pilot. That judgment was wrong. It was not wrong because of what happened afterward. It was wrong in the moment I made it, and the only reason it was corrected was because a junior officer had the integrity to say so. The pilot in question had the discipline to keep working within the chain of command, despite having every reason not to, and the situation itself forced my hand before the error could become permanent. He paused. That is in the record. Permanently. Now we proceed. Rachel was seated in the third row. She was in the room not as the subject of an investigation, but as a participant in the reconstruction of events, a distinction that Holloway had made explicit in the review notice he'd circulated at 0600. She had her notes on the table in front of her and her hands flat beside them, and she was watching Holloway with an expression that she couldn't fully control, because what he just said into the formal record of the United States Air Force was something she had not permitted herself to expect and was not entirely sure how to receive. Price was in the room. He was seated near the back, still in the position of someone who defaults to the edge of important rooms, and he was sitting very straight in the way that young officers sit when they're trying to be invisible and professional simultaneously. Shaw was seated in the front row on the left side. She had been the last person to enter the room. She had arrived exactly at 0800, which was the behavior of someone who has spent the night making decisions and arrived this morning having made them. She had the Arizona case file on the table in front of her, the original, as she had requested delivered to her desk at 9:43 the previous evening. She had read it twice. The second time, she'd used a red pen. Cole was not in the room. He was at the medical facility being available in case the review needed to call him by phone. His memo was in the room, which was the important thing. The review coordinator, a sharp, precise colonel named Dawes, who had been pulled from the safety center and who had clearly read everything before he walked in, opened the formal record and began the timeline reconstruction. He started at 11:47, which was the moment the lightning hit the relay. And this is where the first thing nobody had fully understood became visible to the entire room at once. Dawes put the network display log on the screen. He put the actual field conditions log beside it, assembled from the range safety team's ground observations, which had been recorded independently of the main network. He aligned them by timestamp. The gap was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. 4 minutes and 17 seconds, during which the network displayed a clear northern quarter, clear satellite imagery, and a fire threat located more than 2 miles from Guardian 6's position, while the actual conditions showed an active fire crossing the northern road satellite coverage completely obscured and fire within 1 mile and closing. 4 minutes and 17 seconds during which anyone relying on the network's display was looking at a world that no longer existed. Dawes let the room sit with that for a moment. He didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. The system, he said, continued displaying data without indicating that the data was stale. There was no flag, no alert, no degradation indicator. The display looked exactly the same, whether it was current or 4 minutes old. Shaw said from the front row, "Was this a known vulnerability?" Dawes looked at his file. "Yes, General, it was." The word landed in the room with the specific gravity of a thing that everyone present had hoped would not be true and had suspected might be. 3 separate reports were submitted during the system's development phase, identifying the absence of a staleness indicator as a critical failure point. Dawes continued, "The reports were submitted by junior software integration officers. They were received, logged, and not acted upon. The system went into the exercise with the vulnerability present." Holloway was looking at the screen. His jaw was tight. "Why weren't the reports acted on?" he said. Dawes took a careful breath. The system was already committed to a demonstration schedule. Acting on the reports would have required a delay. The decision was made at the program management level that the risk was acceptable given the controlled exercise environment. Another silence. The controlled exercise environment, Holloway repeated very quietly, that included a wildfire, a lightning strike, and 12 people in a canyon. Yes, sir. This was the first major twist in the room's understanding of the day before. And it changed the moral architecture of everything that had followed, because it meant that the network hadn't simply failed in response to an unexpected storm. The network had contained a known, documented, previously reported flaw that had been set aside because acknowledging it would have been inconvenient. Rachel was watching this from the third row with an expression that Cole had, he been present, would have recognized. It was the expression she wore when something she had always suspected was confirmed in terms that couldn't be argued with. She thought about the paper chart in her breast pocket, about the moment she'd pulled it out in the cockpit because the digital navigation display was giving her half-truths, about 15 years of colleagues laughing gently and not so gently about the major who still carried paper maps like it was 1987. She didn't say anything. She wrote a note. Price in the back row was not writing. He was listening with the focused intensity of someone who was filing everything away for later, because he understood that what was being established in this room was going to matter beyond this room for longer than this room, and he wanted to carry it accurately. Dawes moved forward in the timeline. He covered the radio exchanges. He covered the authorization decisions. He covered the moment Holloway authorized Rachel to descend. He covered the service road, the flares, the drainage crossing, the blocked road, the maintenance strip. He played the audio from the command frequency. The room heard Shaw say, "We follow the checklist," or "We set a precedent that individual judgment supersedes command authority." The room heard Holloway say, "The people on the ground are not a variable in a procedural review." Shaw sat very still in the front row. When the audio stopped, Dawes said, "The formal question for this review is whether the actions taken by Major Bennett constituted a disciplined response to a genuine emergency or an unauthorized deviation from command authority." He looked at the room. "I'll note for the record that Major Bennett requested explicit authorization before every critical action. Descent below minimum altitude authorized. Leading convoy through service road authorized. Final pass with Pavehawk guidance authorized. There was no moment during the event where Major Bennett acted without either authorization or a direct request for it." Dawes paused. What she did without authorization was redirect her aircraft from a maintenance verification flight to the emergency area. The redirect occurred before any formal authorization request was possible, given the time constraints. She reported the redirect immediately on command frequency. He closed his file. My finding on, he said, is that Major Bennett's conduct was disciplined initiative within a framework of command authority. It was not insubordination. The room absorbed this. Then Shaw stood up. Every person in the room looked at her. She was 61 years old and she had 3 stars on her collar, and she had spent the night reading a file she had put down 6 years ago and picking it back up, and the expression on her face was not comfortable and was not meant to be. I need to address something that is not on today's formal agenda, she said, but it is directly relevant to the record of the officer whose actions we've just reviewed. She looked at Dawes. I'm requesting that my statement be entered into the formal record. Dawes looked at Holloway. Holloway nodded once. Proceed, General, Dawes said. Shaw looked at the room. She did not look at Rachel specifically yet. She looked at the room the way a person looks when they need a witness, and the witness has to be everyone. 6 years ago, I served on a review board evaluating an incident involving Major Bennett that occurred during an exercise in Arizona. The board reached a finding that placed primary responsibility for a navigation error on a junior ground controller. Major Bennett submitted cockpit recordings indicating that the original route had received command approval at a level above the controller. She paused. The board was aware of the recordings. I was aware of the recordings. The finding was not adjusted to reflect them. The room was completely still. The reason the finding was not adjusted, Shaw continued, was not evidentiary. The recordings supported Major Bennett's account. The reason was institutional. Adjusting the finding would have required reopening questions about command decisions made at levels above the review board, and that process was considered disruptive. She stopped on the word like she was tasting how inadequate it was. The junior controller accepted a formal notation that was not fully supported by the evidence. Major Bennett received a personnel flag that limited her advancement for 6 years, and I signed both documents. She looked at Rachel for the first time. Rachel was looking back at her. Her expression was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to hear a thing said out loud and has stopped being sure it ever would be. I am requesting, Shaw said, turning back to Dawes, that the Arizona finding be formally reopened, that the junior controller's record be corrected, that Major Bennett's personnel flag be removed and her promotion history be reviewed from the point of the original decision. She paused once more. And I am requesting that my role in the original finding be part of the reopened record. I signed those documents. I made that choice. That belongs in the record too. Dawes was writing very quickly. Holloway was looking at Shaw with an expression that contained several things at once: surprise, respect, and the particular kind of relief that comes when you have been prepared to fight for something and the person you were prepared to fight with stands up and hands it to you instead. Price in the back of the room had stopped breathing for approximately 10 seconds. He started again. Rachel said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, but clearly enough for the recorder to catch it, I want the junior controller's family notified before this becomes official record. His name deserves to be cleared before anyone reads about it in a report. Dawes looked at her. His name, he said. Do you have it? Airman First Class Daniel Reyes, she said. He separated from service 18 months after the Arizona finding. Last address I have for him is Tucson. He has 2 kids. She paused. He sent me a letter when he separated. He wanted me to know he didn't blame me for not being able to stop it. She stopped. I kept the letter. The room was very quiet. Shaw sat down. The act of sitting had the quality of something being completed, not finished, not resolved, but completed. The first necessary step of a longer correction. After the formal review concluded at 11:20, the room did not empty quickly. People moved in the deliberate, slightly dazed way of those who have just witnessed something that recalibrates their understanding of several things simultaneously. Junior officers spoke to each other in low voices near the door. Dawes remained at the table writing notes on his own record. Holloway spoke briefly with 2 of the exercise observers' men who represented other commands and who had been present for the entire review and were now going to carry everything they'd seen back to their own institutions. Rachel was gathering her notes from the table when Price appeared beside her. He was holding the folded document she'd seen in his hands on the flight line the day before. He set it on the table in front of her. "That's your maintenance verification report from yesterday," he said. "Your original flight plan, the one you deviated from." He paused. "I flagged it in the system this morning to ensure it's captured in the record as part of the authorized auxiliary flight activity, not as an unauthorized deviation." He paused again. "The deviation was the redirect, which is covered by the emergency response finding. Your overall flight activity is documented as mission supporting." Rachel looked at the document. She looked at Price. "You've been thinking about this since last night," she said. "Since approximately 14:30 yesterday afternoon," he said, "when you changed course." She studied him. He was 26 years old, and he had the particular quality of some young people who are going to be excellent at something important and don't yet know the full shape of what they're building toward. Seen it before in herself once. In Frank, when she was a child, watching a man jump out of an airplane toward a fire. "Lieutenant Price," she said, "what did Holloway say to you this morning?" Price's expression shifted slightly. "He told me that identifying the available asset was the most important single action taken in the command center yesterday. He said it was going to be formally noted in the exercise after action report." "That's what he told you officially," Rachel said. "What did he say to you as a person?" Price was quiet for a moment. "He said that the hardest thing in any room full of people with rank is to say the true thing when the true thing is inconvenient. He said to keep doing it." Rachel nodded. "Good advice," she said. She picked up her notes. She looked at the document Price had set on the table. She picked that up too. "Walk with me," she said. They walked out of the briefing room and down the corridor toward the operations building entrance, and the conversation that happened in that corridor was one that Price would remember for the remainder of his career, with the specificity of something that happened at a formative age and settled into the architecture of who you become. Rachel talked about initiative, about the difference between initiative that comes from ego and initiative that comes from genuine situational awareness, about how you know which one you're acting from, not always, not perfectly, but well enough by asking whether your action is serving the mission or serving your own need to be the one who solved the problem. About how that distinction, small as it sounds, is the entire game. She talked about paper charts, about why she carried them. Not as a romantic attachment to the past, but as a specific considered choice about redundancy. "Every system fails eventually," she said. "The question isn't whether it fails, it's whether you have something real to fall back on when it does. In a cockpit, that's paper. In a command center, that's the person who's been paying attention instead of watching the screen." She stopped walking at the entrance. "Yesterday," she said, "you were paying attention. You were looking at a real board with real information, and you said a real thing in a room that didn't want to hear it. That's not small. That is specifically and exactly the skill that saved 12 lives yesterday, because everything else, everything I did in that canyon started with you pointing at a board and saying the true thing." Price looked at her. I was 26 years old, and he had been in the Air Force for 3 years, and he had spent a significant portion of his professional life so far feeling like the youngest and least experienced person in every room, which was accurate, and wondering whether that meant he should wait longer before speaking, which was not. I understood in that corridor that Rachel Bennett was not telling him he'd done something good. She was telling him who he was, and that those were different things that required different kinds of listening. "What happens now," he said, "for you, after the record is corrected?" Rachel thought about this. It was a question she'd been circling since 3 in the morning when she'd finished her notes and lay awake, in the way you lie awake when your mind is working on something it hasn't finished yet. "Holloway already offered me a staff position," she said, "before the review. Are you going to take it?" "No." Price waited. "There's something I want to build instead," she said. "Something that lives here at Nellis but isn't about any one aircraft or any one pilot. Something about how we train people to think when the systems fail." She looked at him. "You took visual navigation training. Standard course 3 years ago. Could you fly a canyon route on paper charts and terrain recognition alone?" Price was honest. "No. Most people can't anymore," she said. "Most people are trained to interpret screens faster than they can interpret the world. And that's fine when the screens are right." She paused. "But yesterday the screens were wrong. And the only thing between Guardian 6 and the fire was a pilot who could still look at the world and read it. She started walking again back toward the flight line. I want to change that, she said. Not by going backward, not by removing the technology, but by building the human layer back in underneath it. So that when the relay gets hit by lightning, there's still someone in the cockpit or in the command center who can read what's actually in front of them. Price walked beside her. Would that include command training, he said, for officers in command positions, not just pilots? She looked at him. Yes, she said, definitely that. A pause. I'd like to help build it, he said, if you'd have me. Rachel looked at him for a moment. Get through your current assignment first, she said. Learn everything you can learn where you are, then come find me. She stopped at the edge of the flight line. The A-10 was where she'd left it, surrounded now by maintenance personnel who were doing the detailed inspection that followed any hard-use flight. Two of them were working on the area near the left engine nacelle where heat exposure had left marks that would need evaluation. She looked at the aircraft the way you look at something that has done exactly what you asked of it and come back intact. At the base hospital, Sergeant Cole was out of surgery. The orthopedic surgeon who'd worked on the femur fracture told Mercer, who was sitting in the waiting room with a cup of bad coffee and the burn on his forearm, professionally dressed, that the fracture had been clean, the repair was solid, and that with appropriate recovery and physical therapy, Cole would have full function. Mercer thanked the surgeon, put down the coffee, and called his wife in Alabama. He talked to her for 20 minutes. She knew what the exercise had involved because she was the wife of a man who did this kind of work, which meant she understood the vocabulary of hard days and close calls. He told her everything that had happened in sequence clearly and factually, the way he briefed after difficult operations, because clarity was the only honest container for things this large. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The pilot, she said, and the one who stayed. Bennett, he said. Rachel Bennett. I want you to write her a letter, his wife said. A real letter. Paper. Not an email. Mercer looked at his hand. He thought about the specific quality of Rachel's voice in his earpiece. At the worst moments in the canyon, never overpromising, never performing reassurance, she didn't have basis for just steady and present and working. Yeah, he said, you're right. I usually am, she said. How's the arm? At the command center, Holloway was sitting across from Shaw in the small conference room adjacent to the main operations space. The formal review was over. The recording equipment was off. The observers were gone. It was just the two of them and 2 cups of coffee that both of them had been using for warmth rather than drinking. You didn't have to do what you did in there, Holloway said. Yes, I did, Shaw said. I just didn't do it 6 years ago, which is when I should have. Why now? She looked at him. She thought about the question. She could have given several answers, some of them more comfortable than the true one. Because yesterday I watched Rachel Bennett fly into a canyon that I wouldn't have flown into, she said. Not because I couldn't fly the aircraft, because I would have calculated the institutional risk of what happened if I failed, and I would have held. She paused, and she didn't hold. And 12 people are alive because she didn't hold. And I stood in that room and told you to follow the checklist. She looked at her coffee. I've been in command long enough to know the difference between a pilot who takes risks because they don't understand the consequences, and a pilot who understands them completely and goes anyway because the mission requires it. A pause. Bennett is the second kind. I knew that 6 years ago and I let the findings stand anyway. Holloway looked at her. The program she's proposing, he said, the training group. I'll support it, Shaw said, formally, with my name on it. She paused. And I'll speak to the class when she asks me to. Holloway raised an eyebrow. She hasn't asked yet. She will, Shaw said. She's going to build something real. And the part of it that matters most isn't the navigation training or the paper charts or the system's redundancy protocols. She looked at the window. It's the part about what happens when leadership gets it wrong and someone junior to you sees it. How do you create a culture where that person says what they see? A pause. Price said it yesterday. He's 26. He almost didn't say it. And if he hadn't said it, we'd be having a very different conversation today. Holloway was quiet. She's going to need people who aren't afraid to be the example, Shaw said. The example of getting it wrong and correcting it. That's harder than being the example of getting it right. She picked up her coffee cup. I've been getting things wrong for 6 years. I might as well be useful about it. Outside on the flight line, Rachel Bennett was watching the maintenance team work on her aircraft. One of the technicians, a staff sergeant named Kowalski, who had maintained A-10s for 14 years and who had a particular affection for the aircraft that he would describe when pressed as professional respect, stopped beside her. "She's solid," he said, meaning the aircraft. "Heat exposure on the nacelle is superficial. Left engine is clean. Structure is intact." He paused. "She worked hard yesterday." "She did," Rachel said. Kowalski looked at the aircraft for a moment. He had the expression of a person who is about to say something they've been thinking about, but weren't sure whether to say. "You know what people keep telling us," he said, "about this aircraft? I have a pretty good idea. They keep telling us she's past her time," he said, "that she belongs in a museum, that the mission she was built for doesn't exist anymore." He looked at Rachel. "You know what I tell them?" "Tell me." "I tell them the mission exists as long as there are people on the ground who need someone overhead who won't leave." He paused. "And that an aircraft is only obsolete when it can no longer serve the mission." Rachel looked at him. "Sergeant Kowalski," she said, "that's exactly right." She turned back to the aircraft. The scorched Guardian 6 patch was in her breast pocket, close against her chest where it would stay for a long time. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder of crisis, but as evidence of something she'd always known and now had in a form she could hold. That the distance between 12 people dying and 12 people coming home was not always measured in aircraft capability or systems sophistication or strategic planning. Sometimes it was measured in the willingness of one person to stay. The letter from Daniel Reyes arrived 3 weeks after the formal review. Rachel had not expected it. She had given his name to Dawes and asked that his family be notified before the corrected finding became official record, and she had assumed that was the end of her involvement, that the institution would handle the correction in the way institutions handle corrections, through memos and updated files and official notifications that arrive in envelopes with government return addresses. She had not expected him to write back to her. The letter was handwritten, 2 pages. The handwriting was careful, the kind that belongs to someone who doesn't write by hand often and chose to do it this way deliberately. He wrote that he had been working construction in Tucson for 4 years, that his kids were 7 and 9, that his wife had read the notification letter twice before she believed it, that he had kept his copy of the original finding in a drawer because his father had told him to keep records of everything, and he'd been carrying the weight of that document for 6 years in the specific way you carry something you didn't deserve but couldn't put down. He wrote that he didn't need an apology from the Air Force. He wrote that what he had needed for 6 years, was for someone to say out loud in a document that couldn't be revised later that he had done his job correctly, that the route had been approved, that the error had not been his. He wrote, "I heard what you did in Nevada. My daughter saw it on the news. She asked me if I knew that pilot. I told her we served together once in a way. She asked if you were brave. I told her brave isn't the right word. I told her you were the kind of person who doesn't let go of the true thing, even when letting go would be easier." Rachel read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the same pocket where she kept the Guardian 6 patch. She called Frank. She read him the letter over the phone. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "That's the whole story right there," he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything you did in that canyon, the drainage crossing, the flares, the last pass with the helicopter, all of it started with you not letting go of the true things 6 years ago, with you submitting those cockpit recordings when everyone was telling you to walk away." He paused. "If you'd walked away, Reyes would still be carrying that finding, and you'd probably be a colonel by now. But you wouldn't have been in that cockpit yesterday. You wouldn't have been the person with the paper charts and the eyes that can read a desert floor from 400 feet. A pause. "The price you paid made you who you needed to be." Rachel sat with that for a moment. "That's a hard way to look at it," she said. "Most true things are," Frank said. "The Mission Recovery Training Group was formally established 6 weeks after the Guardian 6 incident. Holloway signed the authorization on a Tuesday morning and handed Rachel the document across his desk with the directness of a man who had decided that ceremony was less important than getting things moving. The program took the hangar adjacent to the A-10 maintenance bay and converted one section of it into a classroom that looked nothing like any other classroom on the base. There were no screens on the walls. There was one large table, a set of chairs, a collection of paper topographic maps mounted on boards, and a radio stack connected to a practice frequency. On the first day Rachel brought the class in, she pointed at all of it and said, "Everything in this room is something that works when the power goes out." The first class was 12 people, pilots, ground coordinators, and 2 command staff officers that Holloway had personally selected. Price was among them. He had finished his current assignment rotation 2 days early by working through a weekend, which was the kind of thing Price did when he decided something mattered. Rachel stood at the front of the class and looked at them for a moment before she said anything. "I'm going to tell you something that will sound like criticism of the Air Force," she said. "It isn't, it's a diagnosis." She paused. "We have trained an entire generation of operators to interpret data faster than they can interpret reality. That is not a mistake. It is the logical result of investing heavily in systems that deliver data faster than human senses can. But it created a gap. And when the data is wrong or delayed or simply absent, that gap becomes a canyon." She stopped on the word deliberately. "Some of you know what I mean by that literally. The rest of you will understand it by the end of this program." Mercer was not in the class. He was still on medical leave while Cole completed recovery, and he had decided to stay close to his team until everyone was back on full duty. But he had sent Rachel a note the morning the program launched. It said, "Build it right. We'll send you our best people when you're ready for them." Maya Torres was there. She was not a student. She was the lead ground coordination instructor, a role that Rachel had offered her in a direct phone call 3 days after the formal review, and that Maya had accepted in approximately 4 seconds. "You're sure," Rachel had said on the phone, because she believed in giving people genuine options. "Major Bennett," Maya had said, "I spent 3 years telling ground teams that their job is to be the eyes the pilot can't have. Nobody ever taught it to me that way. I learned it from doing it wrong first." A pause. "I want to teach it to people before they do it wrong." That, Rachel had said, is exactly the right reason. The first exercise the class ran was simple. Rachel gave them a paper chart, a set of radio protocols, and a scenario in which every digital system was offline. She put Maya in a vehicle on the training range with a radio and told her to describe her position using only terrain features. No GPS coordinates, no grid references from the digital system. Nothing that required a satellite or a relay. The pilots in the class struggled to locate her for 11 minutes. Rachel let it go 11 minutes, then she keyed the radio and said in exactly the tone she had used in the canyon, "Guardian element, look at your chart. Find the drainage line that runs northeast from the ridge you're orbiting. Maya is at the second bend." They found her in 45 seconds. Rachel turned to the class afterward and said, 11 minutes or 45 seconds. That is the difference between a pilot who reads screens and a pilot who reads the world. She paused. In real conditions with a real fire, 11 minutes is the difference between everyone coming home and nobody coming home. Price was writing. He was always writing in that class, not because he had trouble retaining information, but because he had decided that the things Rachel taught deserved to be recorded with the same care she brought to teaching them. 3 months into the program, Shaw came to speak to the class. She arrived without ceremony. No aid, no formal introduction. Just a general in-service dress, walking into the hangar classroom and sitting in one of the chairs at the table, the same way everyone else did. Rachel introduced her by name and rank and said nothing else. Shaw looked at the class. She looked at the paper maps on the wall. She looked at Price in the second row, who was looking back at her with an expression that was professional and completely attentive. She spoke for 40 minutes. She told the class about the Arizona Review Board. She told them what the cockpit recording showed and what the findings said, and what the gap between those two things meant for a 24-year-old airman named Daniel Reyes and for a major named Rachel Bennett. She told it without softening and without self-exculpation. Not the comfortable version where a good person made a difficult decision under institutional pressure, but the accurate version where a person chose institutional convenience over individual justice and had lived with that choice for 6 years before the consequences of it walked into a canyon and forced a reckoning. She said, "The reason I'm telling you this is not to confess. I'm not here for absolution. I'm here because the most dangerous thing in any institution is the belief that rank makes your judgment reliable, that experience makes you immune to error, that the hierarchy exists to protect you from being wrong." She paused. It doesn't. It exists to accomplish the mission. And when the mission is protecting 12 people in a canyon, the hierarchy has to be flexible enough to hear the truth from the most junior person in the room. She looked at Price. Lieutenant Price said the true thing in a room full of people who outranked him, she said. That action was a direct link in the chain that brought 12 people home. It needs to be understood that way, not as a nice story about a young officer who spoke up, but as a critical operational decision made by the right person at the right moment because he was paying attention and had the courage to say what he saw. She paused. That kind of courage needs to be cultivated, deliberately, by every senior officer in this room and in every room you'll occupy for the rest of your careers. She stood up. Major Bennett asked me to do this, she said. She didn't ask me to come here and be a cautionary tale. She asked me to be a reason to believe that institutions can actually correct themselves when the correction is overdue. She looked at Rachel. I'm still deciding whether she's an optimist or just someone who's very patient. Rachel said from the side of the room, Frank says I'm patient. My students say I'm relentless. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The class laughed. It was the real kind of laugh, surprised out of people by something unexpectedly human in a moment that had been heavy with weight. Shaw almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She left the class the way she'd arrived, quietly without ceremony, carrying the specific posture of someone who has done something they needed to do and is now moving forward from it. After she left, the class was quiet for a moment. Then Price said from the second row, Is she going to be okay? Rachel looked at him. Define okay, she said. I mean, is she going to carry this the way Ray has carried it? Rachel thought about this seriously. She didn't dismiss the question because it came from a junior officer, and she didn't dismiss it because it was uncomfortable. Shaw made a choice with clear eyes, she said. She knew what the recording showed, and she let the findings stand. Reyes was 24 years old and followed an approved route correctly. Those are not equivalent weights to carry. She paused. But Shaw is also the person who stood up in the formal review and put her name on a public correction of her own decision. That doesn't erase the original choice, but it's real. It counts. She looked at the class. What we're building here has to have room for both things, the accountability and the correction. Otherwise, we're just building a different kind of institution that punishes the same people more efficiently. The class absorbed that. Maya from the back of the room said quietly, That's the lesson right there, what she just said. Rachel looked at her. Write it down, she said to the class. All of it. 6 months after the Guardian of 6 incident, the program had graduated 2 full classes and had a waiting list for the third. Word had moved through the Air Force the way word moves about things that actually work. Not through official channels, not through press releases, but through pilots and ground coordinators and command staff officers who had been through the program and gone back to their units and demonstrated in real exercises and real situations that the gap between screen-dependent operation and genuine situational awareness was closable and that closing it mattered. Holloway attended the graduation of the second class. He sat in the back of the hangar and watched Rachel run the final exercise, a simulated canyon extraction with all digital systems, degraded multiple aircraft types, and a ground team that included 2 new coordinators who had never worked with Rachel before. The exercise ran clean, not perfectly. There were moments of confusion, one near miss on a radio frequency conflict, one vehicle that took a wrong turn and had to be talked back to the road. But when it was over, every simulated team member was at the designated extraction point, and the debrief showed that every error had been identified in real time and corrected within the mission window. Holloway stood up afterward and said to nobody in particular, That's what a functional system looks like. Cole was standing beside him. He was back on full duty, walking without a limp that the surgeons had been unsure about for the first 2 months. He had come to the graduation with Mercer, who was also back on full duty, and Maya, who was technically still running a class, but had asked for 3 hours to attend. Cole said, You know she turned down the staff position. I know, Holloway said. She could have had a command by now. The promotion review went through. Her record is clean. The path is open. Holloway watched Rachel on the other side of the hangar, standing with 2 students who were asking her something about the radio exercise, gesturing at a paper chart that one of them was holding, pointing at a feature with the specific economy of motion that belonged to someone who has taught the same thing many times and knows exactly which detail matters. She doesn't want the path, Holloway said. She wants this. Cole was quiet for a moment. Is that a problem? Holloway thought about the command center on the day of the crisis, about the screen that showed a clear northern quarter while fire burned across it, about the voice that entered the emergency frequency and said simply and without theater, Guardian 6, this is Rook 1. I heard your call. No, he said, this is exactly where she belongs. The plaque went up on the wall of the operations center on the same day the second class graduated. Rachel had designed it herself, not with a name on it, not with a date or a unit designation or any of the formal apparatus of military commemoration. Just one sentence in plain type on a dark background. Technology can extend human judgment. It can never replace the courage to use it. Holloway stood in front of it that evening after everyone else had gone. He stood there long enough that the light through the window changed and the base outside went from the amber of late afternoon to the flat gray of early evening. I thought about the moment he'd shouted, "Any jet will do," not the words themselves, which were fine, which were the reasonable expression of a commander desperate for a solution, but the thought underneath them, the assumption that had been so settled in him, he hadn't known it was there until it was wrong. The assumption that newer was better, that a faded flight suit and a stalled promotion and a weathered aircraft added up to less than they actually were. I thought about what less had turned out to mean. Price found him there 20 minutes later. The young lieutenant had the look of someone who'd stayed late finishing something and was on his way out when he noticed the colonel standing alone in front of the plaque. He started to walk past. Holloway said without turning around, "Price." Price stopped. "What's the most important thing you have learned in this program so far?" Price thought about this without rushing it. He had learned from Rachel that questions deserved real answers, not rapid ones. That the gap between what the screen shows and what's actually there, he said slowly, is always present, even when the screen is right, because the screen is always a translation, and something gets lost in every translation. He paused. The job is to know what's been lost. Holloway turned and looked at him. "Write that down too," he said. Price said, "I did. Day one. An emergency call came in on a Thursday morning 9 months after Guardian 6. A ground team in a training scenario on the northern range had lost navigation and was calling for aerial guidance. The weather was poor, not a crisis, not a wildfire, just the difficult, limiting kind of weather that makes everything harder and slower. The duty officer in the command center began his standard checklist. He had 3 aircraft available. He was pulling up the digital assignment roster when the window glass vibrated with a sound that everyone in the building recognized by now. The low, unmistakable growl of the A-10. The duty officer looked at his roster. Bennett, our Mission Recovery Training Group. He looked at the window. He looked back at his roster. He made the call. He picked up the radio. Rachel's voice was already on the frequency. "Ground team, this is Rook 1. I have your position. Stay together, conserve your water, and follow my wings. Everyone is coming home." The duty officer set down his roster. He looked at the younger operator beside him, a specialist just 3 weeks into the assignment who had his headset on and was leaning slightly forward with the attentive urgency of someone witnessing something real for the first time. The specialist said, "Is she always like that?" The duty officer thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Every time," he said. Outside, the A-10 banked north. The sound of its engines rolled across the base and over the training range and into the ears of a ground team that was lost and scared and had just heard a voice tell them with the full weight of everything that voice had already survived and already done and already refused to walk away from that they were going to be all right. Some pilots fly to prove something. Some pilots fly to advance. Some pilots fly because the rank and the aircraft in the mission form a version of themselves they recognize and need. Rachel Bennett flew because people needed to come home. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it, and no amount of institutional friction or stalled promotions or dismissive colonels or flawed reviews had ever changed it, because the thing that drives a person toward a burning canyon, when every rational calculation says to hold, is not ambition, and it is not pride, and it is not even courage, in the way that word is usually used. It is the simple, unshakable conviction that the person on the other end of the radio deserves someone who won't leave. Rachel Bennett had never left. She never would.